There is a question I have been hearing constantly from my students, from my audience, and from serious analysts trying to make sense of this conflict. If Israel genuinely believes Iran is an existential threat, if Israeli leaders are sitting in rooms saying Iran is months away from a nuclear weapon, that the clock is running out, that the survival of the state is at stake, then why hasn't Israel ended it? Why no invasion? Why no ground troops? Why, with one of the most capable militaries in the world and what appears to be a genuine belief that time is running out, has everything stayed in the air and at a distance? On the surface, it seems almost paradoxical. You have a state that defines itself around the imperative of Jewish survival. You have a military that has demonstrated repeatedly the willingness to act decisively and to absorb the international consequences of doing so. You have leaders who speak in apocalyptic terms about the Iranian threat, and yet the boots stay home.
Most of the commentary you will find on this question gives you one of two unsatisfying answers. Either Israel is being restrained by international pressure and American reluctance, or Israel is waiting for the right strategic moment, accumulating damage through the air campaign until the conditions for a decisive ground operation are right. Both of those answers are partially true. Neither of them is the real answer. The real answer is more unsettling, and it has nothing to do with hesitation or external constraint. A ground invasion of Iran could trigger a chain of consequences that Israel might not survive. Not lose, not be set back by, might not survive. My name is Jiang Xueqin. I teach predictive history, the application of game theory and civilizational pattern recognition to understand the logic driving decisions that, on the surface, appear contradictory. Today, I want to walk you through exactly why Israel, with all of its military capability and all of its stated urgency, has drawn a very precise line at the Iranian border and has not crossed it. Because understanding that line tells you more about the real state of this conflict than almost anything else you will read or watch. Let me start with the most basic question. How many soldiers could Israel actually send into Iran? Not theoretically, not on paper. Realistically, given existing commitments, given the security requirements that cannot be suspended, given the actual force structure of the Israeli Defense Forces as it exists today, the IDF has approximately 170,000 active duty personnel. Army, Air Force, Navy, intelligence, everything combined. That is the entire professional military force of the state of Israel. Now begin subtracting. There are active deployments along the Gaza border, units in the West Bank conducting ongoing security operations, major defensive formations in the north watching a Lebanese front that has been in a state of controlled tension for over a year, air defense crews protecting Israeli cities around the clock, naval forces maintaining coastal security. These are not optional commitments that can be paused while a larger operation runs. These are active security requirements with real consequences if they are reduced. Once you subtract everything that is already tied down, military analysts estimate that somewhere around 70,000 active duty personnel could realistically be redirected toward a major external operation. 70,000 soldiers. Now hold that number against the reality of what a ground campaign in Iran would require. Iran covers 1.6 million square kilometers. Its population exceeds 85 million people. Its terrain, and I have discussed this in detail elsewhere, is mountainous, complex, and historically catastrophic for invading armies. Military doctrine for counterinsurgency operations uses a general planning ratio of roughly 20 soldiers per 1,000 civilians to maintain meaningful control of territory. Apply that ratio to Iran's population. You need north of 500,000 troops just to manage the territory before you account for combat losses, before you account for the supply requirements of forces operating hundreds of kilometers from home, before you account for the second front that would almost certainly open simultaneously. Israel has 70,000 available. The gap between what the mission requires and what Israel can provide is not a logistical challenge. It is a fundamental structural impossibility. Someone always raises reserves at this point. And it is true. Israel can theoretically mobilize around 460,000 reservists. That number sounds like it changes the calculation entirely. But here is what that mobilization actually looks like in practice. Those reservists have already been called up repeatedly over the past several years. Gaza, northern tensions, ongoing security operations. Each mobilization pulls engineers from construction sites, doctors from hospitals, factory workers from assembly lines, teachers from classrooms. Entire sectors of the Israeli economy slow down or stop. The social cost accumulates, the economic cost accumulates, and the political cost, the pressure from Israeli citizens who have been living in a state of semi-permanent emergency mobilization, builds with every call-up. There is real and growing resistance inside Israeli society to the idea of another massive mobilization that keeps hundreds of thousands of people in uniform for an extended period. The economy cannot absorb it indefinitely. The social fabric cannot absorb it indefinitely. And even if you solve the manpower problem, even if Israel could somehow mobilize the numbers the mission would require without fracturing its own society, you still have not solved the second problem. The one that, in my assessment, weighs most heavily in Israeli strategic thinking. The moment Israeli boots cross into Iranian territory, a completely different calculation activates. Not in Tehran, in Beirut. For over a year, Hezbollah has maintained what both sides tacitly understand as controlled tension along the northern border. Rockets, drones, small exchanges of fire calibrated carefully to maintain pressure without crossing the threshold into full war. That restraint is not weakness, it is patience, strategic patience of a very specific kind. Hezbollah is believed to have a fighting force of approximately 100,000 personnel. Tens of thousands of trained, equipped, combat-ready fighters who have been preparing for one particular scenario for nearly 2 decades. Since 2006, they have been building tunnel networks into northern Israel, stockpiling missiles and anti-tank weapons, constructing firing positions embedded in civilian infrastructure, studying Israeli tactics and doctrine with the obsessive attention of an organization that knows exactly what it is preparing for. That scenario is the moment Israel commits the bulk of its ground forces somewhere else. Think about what an Iranian invasion looks like from Hezbollah's perspective. Israel has redirected tens of thousands of soldiers to an operation hundreds of kilometers from home. Supply lines are stretched. Command attention is divided. The northern border is thinner than it has been at any point in recent memory. That is the opening Hezbollah has been waiting for. And according to every serious military analyst who has studied its doctrine and its capabilities, Hezbollah's leadership has been explicit about its intention to exploit exactly that opening. A coordinated Hezbollah ground offensive into northern Israel, launched precisely when Israeli forces are committed elsewhere, is not a speculative scenario. It is the scenario that Israeli military planners lose sleep over. And here is why it is so particularly dangerous. Israeli security doctrine rests on a foundational principle that is simultaneously military strategy and political contract with its own citizens. Wars get fought outside Israeli borders. Israeli civilians do not encounter enemy forces inside their towns and cities. That principle is not just tactical preference. It is the psychological basis of the social contract between the Israeli government and the population it governs. If Hezbollah fighters crossed into northern Israel and held Israeli territory, even a single community, even for days rather than weeks, the consequences would extend far beyond the military dimension. The political crisis inside Israel would be severe. The psychological damage to the foundational premise of Israeli security would be lasting. And the government responsible for allowing it would face consequences that no military success in Iran could offset. So Israel is not looking at a ground invasion of Iran in isolation. It is looking at a simultaneous two-front war, Iran and Lebanon, against adversaries that have coordinated their preparations specifically around that scenario. And the manpower that was already insufficient for Iran alone is now being asked to fight on two fronts at once. And now I want to discuss the dimension that makes this entire situation genuinely paradoxical. Because the logic here is deeply counterintuitive. And I think it is the consideration that most fundamentally shapes Israeli decision making. The stated justification for military action against Iran is Iran's nuclear program. The argument is that Iran is approaching the capability to build a nuclear weapon, that a nuclear-armed Iran represents an existential threat to Israel, and that military action is necessary to prevent that outcome. The paradox is this: a ground invasion of Iran is probably the single action most likely to accelerate Iranian nuclear development rather than stop it. Let me explain the logic carefully because it is important. Iran has not yet crossed the final threshold to a nuclear weapon. It has accumulated enriched uranium. It has developed the technical knowledge. Multiple intelligence assessments suggest it could assemble a device within weeks or months if the political decision were made. But it has not made that decision. It has stopped short of the final step. Why? Because crossing that line carries enormous costs. Deeper international sanctions, diplomatic isolation, a dramatically increased probability of military strikes. The calculation, until now, has been that the costs of weaponization exceed the security benefits. A ground invasion changes that calculation completely. Not incrementally, completely. If Iranian leadership faces armored columns moving toward their cities, not airstrikes, not sanctions, but actual military forces advancing toward the capital, the pressure to cross the nuclear threshold immediately becomes not just overwhelming, but rationally compelling. Because history has established one lesson with brutal clarity. Countries without nuclear weapons get invaded. Countries with nuclear weapons do not. North Korea understood this and built its weapon. Pakistan understood this. Every government on earth has absorbed this lesson. And Iranian leadership, which is many things but is not strategically unsophisticated, absolutely understands it. The invasion designed to prevent Iranian nuclear development could be the precise trigger that produces Iranian nuclear development, compressed from months into days by the existential pressure of imminent military defeat. And once that threshold is crossed, the strategic environment transforms in ways that cannot be reversed. Israel has maintained an undeclared nuclear deterrent for decades. The unspoken guarantee that if the state faces destruction, the capability exists to retaliate with devastating force. That deterrent has functioned because Israel's adversaries could not respond in kind. The asymmetry was the deterrent. The moment Iran develops a credible nuclear arsenal, that asymmetry disappears. Nuclear deterrence begins operating in both directions. And here is where geography introduces a calculation that Israeli strategic planners confront with cold clarity. Israel is a small country. 9 million people concentrated in a handful of urban centers, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, clustered along a narrow coastal strip. There is no territorial depth. There is no dispersion. A nuclear exchange of even limited scale would be catastrophic and potentially unsurvivable as a functioning society. Iran is the opposite. 85 million people distributed across a vast territory, dozens of cities, enormous geographic depth. The same exchange that eliminates Israel as a functional state leaves Iran damaged but intact as a civilization. Israeli planners understand this arithmetic. They sit with it. And it makes triggering Iranian nuclear breakout through a ground invasion not a risk to be managed, but a potential civilizational catastrophe to be avoided at almost any cost. There's one more constraint that does not receive enough attention, and that is the question of whether Israel could sustain a ground campaign in Iran without reliable international support. For decades, American backing has been critical to Israeli military operations, not just diplomatically, practically. Intelligence sharing, advanced weapons systems, logistical support, ammunition resupply, The infrastructure of a major military operation depends on partnerships that Israel cannot replicate independently. But a ground invasion of Iran places Washington in an extraordinarily difficult position. The United States has spent 20 years and trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The American public's appetite for another large-scale ground war in the Middle East is, by any honest assessment, essentially non-existent. American military planners who watch those campaigns understand better than anyone what occupying a large, hostile, nationally unified country actually requires. Most private assessments conclude that Iran would be harder than Iraq or Afghanistan ever were. And without strong American logistical backing, Israel cannot sustain extended operations hundreds of kilometers from home. Fuel, ammunition, replacement equipment, medical evacuation, all of it has to move through airspace controlled by other countries: Jordan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Governments that might tolerate limited airstrikes as a manageable political cost might calculate very differently about actively supporting a full-scale ground invasion. Each of them faces their own domestic populations, their own regional relationships, their own economic interests that a regional war would put at risk. The coalition of tolerance that has allowed the air campaign to continue is a genuinely fragile thing. It does not automatically extend to ground operations. And Israel operating alone or nearly alone across that distance against that adversary in that terrain runs out of sustainable capacity long before it runs out of strategic objectives. So let me bring this together, because understanding why Israel will not cross this particular line tells you something important about how this conflict is actually being managed. The manpower does not exist at the necessary scale. The Northern Front would open almost immediately. The invasion designed to prevent nuclear development would accelerate it. The logistical chain cannot be sustained without support that is not reliably available. Each of these problems would be serious individually. Together they form a strategic boundary, a line that Israeli military and political leadership has drawn not out of hesitation, but out of a clear-eyed assessment of what crossing it would actually produce. What you are watching instead is a strategy of management rather than elimination. Airstrikes that demonstrate capability without triggering the full consequences of a ground war, cyber operations that disrupt and delay, targeted eliminations that degrade specific capabilities, economic pressure through the American-led sanctions architecture. Each action calibrated to impose cost without crossing the threshold that activates the chain reaction. This is not a strategy of victory, it is a strategy of constraint. Keeping the Iranian threat below the threshold of intolerable while avoiding the actions that would make it existentially worse. And here is what that strategy reveals about the deeper reality of this conflict. In game theory, there is a concept called the dominated strategy, a choice that produces worse outcomes than the available alternatives regardless of what the other side does. A ground invasion of Iran is for Israel close to a dominated strategy. The scenarios in which it produces acceptable outcomes are narrow. The scenarios in which it produces catastrophic ones are broad and well documented. Recognizing a dominated strategy and refusing to play it is not weakness. It is the clearest expression of strategic rationality. And whatever else one might say about Israeli military and political leadership, they have demonstrated in this specific decision a strategic rationality that the simplistic question, why don't they just finish it, completely fails to appreciate. The distance between Israeli capability and Israeli action is not hesitation. It is calculation. Cold, clear, unsentimental calculation about what is survivable and what is not. I began by asking why Israel, with all of its military capability and all of its stated urgency, has not crossed the Iranian border. The answer is not one thing. It is four things operating simultaneously, each one serious enough on its own, and together forming a strategic boundary that any rational actor with access to the same information would draw in the same place. The manpower gap between what is available and what the mission requires is not a logistical problem. It is a fundamental impossibility. The Northern Front is not a secondary risk. It is a coordinated threat that has been prepared specifically for the moment Israel commits its forces elsewhere. The nuclear paradox is not theoretical. The invasion designed to prevent the weapon could be the trigger that produces it on a timeline no one can control. And the logistics of operating alone at that distance against that adversary without reliable international support make a sustained campaign structurally unsustainable. This is why the strategy you are watching is an air campaign. Not because Israel lacks the will to do more, but because the people responsible for Israeli survival have looked at what more actually means and drawn a line at exactly the place the analysis says they should. Understanding where that line is and why it exists is essential to understanding where this conflict goes next.